All right. Hey there, everyone. Good morning. Question today. What is a TV show that you really enjoyed as a kid? Andy going with My Little Pony? Might still be a favorite. Jason also with My Little Pony? Futurama? Good, good. Max and Ruby for Sam. Nice. Noah going with the original Teen Titans. I like it. That was a good show. Team Umizoomi. This is one I am not familiar with. I gotta quickly Google this. I gotta see what this show looked like. Hmm. Pokemon, also a good one. Crashbox for Cadence. Huh, I've not heard of Crashbox, but apparently it started back in the 90s. It's got a unique animation look to it. Interesting. Cool, cool. Thanks for sharing. iCarly. My youngest brother was a big fan of that one. Excellent. So today we're starting up Unit 3, which Unit 3 is really kind of taking a deep dive into the three branches of government. Yesterday afternoon, should have gotten an email that had the Unit 3 study guide. Again, highly recommend using the study guide as a note-taking guide during class and going through the K-12 lessons. And we're going to begin today digging deeper into the legislative branch, Congress. So today we'll kind of explore in more detail some of the powers and responsibilities of Congress, and also kind of the leadership structure within Congress. So that's kind of our game plan for today. A couple of things to note here on the right. Again, as you're taking the Unit 2 test, if you end up not being happy with your Unit 2 test grade, you're not stuck with it. You can email me a completed study guide in order to earn a retake, which again is kind of one of the reasons why it might be a good idea to just kind of fill out the study guide as we go through each unit so that you have that at the end of the unit if you need it. And as some other TV shows mentioned there in the chat, Big Time Rush. Chores? Was Chores the name of a show? All right. So starting off with Congress here, I actually kind of want to begin with a political cartoon. So take a moment to kind of look at this cartoon, try to pay attention to kind of everything that's going on in it. And then I'll bring up the polling tools here for you to share. Do you feel like this cartoon has a positive or negative view of Congress? A, if you think it's a positive depiction of Congress. B, if you think it's negative. And you should be able to drag the polling tools off to the side if you need to look at the cartoon more. What do we think? Is this a positive or negative view of Congress? A, if you think positive. B, negative. Got responses from most people, looking for just a couple still. Alex, Brensley, Destiny, Gracie, Javion. Are you there? Perfect. Thank you, Alex. Do, 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 do. Okay, good deal. And we're largely in agreement that this is a negative depiction of Congress. Good, excellent. So in the chat share, how do you know? What were different things that were leading you towards it being a negative view of Congress? Jordan kind of noting that you have Santa here saying he doesn't believe in Congress. Anything else that kind of helps paint a negative view of Congress here? Yeah, Jorgen.
Okay, one, I have a quick question. Are we on the study guide? Are we just going through 1 and 2 today?
I would have to pull up the study guide.
Okay, sorry. And then one thing I think I know the notice is we got Santa sitting on Congress's lap, um, which kind of makes it feel like Congress is basically ruling everything, and Santa is just having to be ruled by Congress. But then you kind of got the blackness, which just like marks from the sky. So that kind of depicts it as being like Congress being evil, in my opinion.
Gotcha. Yeah, because obviously black sketchiness was intentional. The cartoonist added that in for a reason. So that's a good thought there. And as far as questions we'll do on the study guide, 1, a little bit of 5, and 7. Oh, 8 as well, it looks like. Anything about the appearance of the member of Congress that kind of further creates a negative depiction of things? Anybody notice anything there? Definitely cadence, kind of does. And I agree. Yeah, I think the smoking of the cigar is part of that. Kind of gives the impression that this is not a friendly person or a caring person. In addition to that, anyone take a look at his yes, exactly, Sam. The fact that his tie has dollar signs all over it. What do you think the cartoonist is trying to say there about Congress? Having a bunch of dollar signs on the tie. Maybe hoarding money or kind of being greedy with money in one way or another. Yeah, so we have here a cartoon that clearly does not seem to have a positive depiction of Congress or positive view. Money voted, shady guy, absolutely. And in many ways, this cartoon reflects the attitude that a lot of Americans have towards Congress. What you are looking at here is the country's approval rating of Congress. What percent of Americans approve of Congress? And you can see that, really throughout the majority of your guys' lifetime, Congress has had a pretty low approval rating, at some points being as low as in the single digits. So in our modern era, Americans tend to not have a positive view towards Congress. Which then does kind of raise an interesting question because, of course, as voters, we get to vote who our members of Congress are. And so, that raises the question, if everyone is so unhappy with Congress, why don't we just vote in new members of Congress? Why do so many members of Congress get reelected? And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is the fact, though, that when you ask Americans about their specific member of Congress, they tend to say, oh, no, I like my member of Congress. It's all those other members of Congress that I have a problem with. And so there's kind of an interesting dynamic there that while the country as a whole would tend to agree that they would like to see a lot of new faces in Congress, for the most part, people who run for re-election in Congress tend to win re-election. Uh, but that's I like to kind of start our deep dive into Congress of kind of recognizing the fact that a lot of Americans kind of have a negative opinion of Congress. Um, in some ways, I think that's inevitable because, as we'll look at when we get to how Congress actually passes laws, that is a difficult process that makes it hard for things to get passed, but that can be frustrating to the average American. But we'll also maybe talk about how Congress could maybe change how it does some things to maybe improve its approval rating a bit. So, starting today, but going into our Class Connects next week as well, we'll try to answer this student question of how does Congress work? Or in some cases, why does it not work? But to begin with, remember, Congress is what makes up our legislative branch here in the United States. And again, our legislative branch, our Congress, is what's called a bicameral legislative branch, meaning that it's made up of two groups or two houses. That was part of the Great Compromise in writing up the Constitution. They both meet in the same building in Washington, D.C., the Capitol building that you see here. But they operate on different wings or different sides of the Capitol building. So the Senate occupies one half of the Capitol building. The House of Representatives operates the other half. And as a quick refresher from last unit, what again is the primary role of the legislative branch in government? What's kind of its job or what's its purpose? Excellent, Jorgen. Yeah. To make the laws. So that's the primary thing Congress is responsible for doing. We're gonna dig into that process in its own Class Connect because that's such a complicated process. It takes its own lesson to kind of go through it. So what we're going to kind of look at here today are what are some of the other powers and responsibilities Congress has besides making laws. And so what is arguably one of the biggest is the Constitution gives Congress the power to decide when the country goes to war, to declare war, as it's known. Which Congress has only done 5 times over the course of U.S. history. And so this is just for fun. No worries if you know or not. But if you had to take a guess, if you had to throw a year out there, what year? And no fair looking it up. Just no, what year would you guess was the last time Congress declared war? If you had to throw a year out there. Sam going was 1940. Ellie was 1964. 1895 for Jorgen. 1940. Couple of guesses for 1940. Now we got A 1940 bandwagon going on here. 1945. Excellent, excellent. 1756. Excellent. So, a little bit, Sam. Yeah, a little bit. People like the answer. Because yeah, it ultimately is very close to being correct. Off by just 1 year. 1941 would be the last time Congress officially declared war. So the 5 times Congress actually declared war would be the War of 1812 against the British, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, and World War II. So World War II is the last time Congress declared war. But do any of you know or maybe recall from U.S. history, has America been involved in wars since World War II? Good. Yeah, we got a couple of yeses. Any examples come to mind? So you do have the Cold War. Now, that's a tricky one because, as the name implies, we didn't directly fight the Soviet Union. So you didn't need a declaration of war for the Cold War. But definitely that was an ongoing struggle. Good. And then the Korean War and the Vietnam War, those were both conflicts where U.S. soldiers, were sent out onto the battlefield. Didn't actually declare war for either of those. A couple of people mentioned Ukraine. That is a situation where America is not directly involved in the fighting. We are providing money and resources to help Ukraine out. But you don't actually have American soldiers actually fighting in the war in Ukraine currently. So we wouldn't need a declaration of war for that one. But yeah, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, those are all conflicts where you actually had American troops in action. And Braden, to your question, you would have perhaps people in Russia who would make that argument because they want Ukraine and Poland to be part of Russia. If you were to ask the Ukrainians and the Polish people that, though, they would very strongly say no, that they are very much distinct, different groups, and that they do not want to be considered part of Russia. You could use the general categorization of them being Eastern European, but Polish people and Ukrainian people would identify themselves as being separate from Russia. I believe, generally speaking, Poland is not considered Slavic. Ukraine, yes, I would say so, but I believe Poland is not traditionally identified as being Slavic. Don't quote me on that, though. Oh, nice, Jorgen. All right, so yeah, as we were saying here, there's at least 5 major conflicts that we call wars, like the Vietnam War and the Korean War, and American soldiers were fighting. But Congress never actually declared war. And Brady, if you want to ask me that at the end of class, be more than happy to address that. And so, what's going on here? What's the situation? How can America be involved in these conflicts without declaring war? And gotcha, Jason. Yeah, that was one I wasn't entirely sure of. So yeah, I could see that being either way. And what's kind of been the situation is post World War II, the country has increasingly looked to the presidency to kind of lead when the country goes to war. And on one hand, that kind of makes sense. We oftentimes look at the president as being the leader of the country. The president is the commander in chief of the military. Um, but what I really want us to focus on is the second question here is what potentially might be the pros and cons of leaving it up to the president um, to decide when we go to war versus having Congress make that decision. And Jorgen, to your question, I would lean towards no. Um, Trump definitely took aggressive actions towards Iran that made some people concerned could have turned into a war. Um, but in terms of actively like calling for a war, no. So I want you to take a couple of minutes here, and then as a private chat message, send me your thoughts. Um, would you consider it a good or a bad idea to kind of leave it up to the president to decide when America goes to war? Why would that potentially be a good idea, or why might it not be a good idea? So take 5 minutes to think about that. Send me your thoughts. We'll come back here at 9:42. All right. And at this point, I've already gotten a lot of responses. So let's just give it another minute to finish typing up a response if you haven't sent it to me already. All right. If you're still typing up a response, that's fine. Finish it up. Want to hear from you. But try to get as many responses as I can here on the whiteboard. And as a group, we seem to largely be in agreement that no, this may not be a great idea, kind of leaving it up to the president to decide if the country goes to war or not. Several of you saying that kind of gives a lot of power to one person. War is kind of a really big decision. It kind of has a huge impact on the country and the world. Do we really want one person making that decision? Some of you mentioned, the president might have a personal motivation to go to war or might get influenced to go to war when it's not necessarily what's best for the country. And so some of you mentioning how it would be important to kind of have multiple people making that decision. And yeah, that very much was the thinking of the writers of the Constitution, is like, hey, going to war is a really serious decision. We don't want one person to make that decision. We're going to give that responsibility to Congress. Because Congress is arguably supposed to be the most representative part of government to the people. Because it represents all the different states, and people, get to vote for their members of Congress. But yeah, in recent years, we have seen Congress kind of give up this responsibility. And as Congress has kind of given up this responsibility, that has really kind of put more power in the hands of the presidency. In regards to the Vietnam War, for example, Congress passes what's called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution that basically gave the president a blank check to decide if and when military engagement would be used in Vietnam. And so it ultimately ended up being the decision of President Johnson to expand America's involvement in the Vietnam War. Similar thing happens with the second Iraq War. After 9/11, Congress passes a very similar resolution that says, hey, it's up to the president to decide if the military needs to be used in Iraq. And so that has ultimately expanded the power of the presidency as a result. Now, in recent years, you've started to see more members of Congress kind of recognize that maybe Congress has made a mistake, that Congress maybe needs to be more proactive in kind of reining in president's flexibility to use military force whenever they see fit. You, for example, saw some of that after President Trump's decisions regarding Iran and using military force there against Iran. Some members of Congress have saying like, okay, this easily could have turned into a full-blown war with Iran. Maybe Congress needs to kind of set some more limits on how much freedom and flexibility we give presidents to use military power. So, declaring war officially is the responsibility of Congress. Again, Congress hasn't really been too involved in or as involved in that in more recent US history, but officially only Congress can decide when America declares war. Constitution also gives Congress the power to establish the federal courts. You may recall when we were going through the Constitution that Article 3, the article about the judicial branch, is very short. There's not a lot to it. It has ultimately been the responsibility of Congress to really kind of set up the federal judicial branch. And we'll explore that in more detail when we get to the judicial branch later on in this unit. The Constitution also gives the House of Representatives and the Senate specific powers and responsibilities. So when we kind of look at some of the differences between the House and the Senate, one difference is their responsibilities. For example, the Constitution states that any changes to tax laws have to begin in the House of Representatives. And again, the thought process there was the House of Representatives is the part of government, most directly elected by the people. So if Congress ends up passing a tax law that the American people really don't like and disagree with, Americans really don't have to wait that long before they can vote in new members to the House of Representatives who would theoretically change that tax law. House of Representatives also has the power of impeachment, which we talked a little bit about last unit. But this is a common misconception a lot of Americans have, so it's worth reviewing. In order for a member of government to be impeached, all that requires is a simple majority vote from the House of Representatives. So you just need one vote more than half of the members of House from the House of Representatives, and a member of government is impeached. Being impeached does not mean that a person is removed from office. In fact, most of the time when members of government are impeached, they do not get removed from office because impeachment is essentially just a formal statement of charges from the House of Representatives. It is the House of Representatives saying, we think this member of government has done something illegal or unethical that is potentially worth removing them from power. But again, just because someone gets impeached does not automatically mean they are removed. Because once the House votes for impeachment, then we go to the Senate, because the Senate has some special responsibilities as well. And one of those responsibilities of the Senate is to carry out trials for a member of government who has been impeached. And so an impeachment trial then in many ways kind of operates similar to trials you might be familiar like on crime shows, where lawyers are brought in to kind of present the case either for or against removal. Potentially witnesses and evidence can be brought in to further try to present the case of why a member of government may need to be removed. If it's an impeachment trial for a president, we bring in the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who kind of sits and oversees the trial just like a judge would in a criminal trial. And then once the trial is done, once lawyers from both sides have kind of presented their case, presented their arguments, the Senate takes a vote. And in order to remove a government official, including a president of the United States, 2/3 of the Senate have to vote for removal, which ultimately is kind of hard to do. It's hard to get 2/3 of the Senate to agree to something, because the Senate tends to be pretty evenly divided, Democrat versus Republican nowadays. So, kind of thinking about this, on one hand, why might it be important that there is a process to remove a president from power? Why would that arguably be something we would want to kind of have in the system? Yeah, Jorgen.
Well, first off, it's basically to make sure people don't abuse impeachment. Like, oh, we don't like Joe Biden, or we don't like Morgan Swanson. We impeach him, and something like that. And then it also makes it difficult more difficult for the process to be impeached. It makes it where people during the time of impeachment, people can make sure they figure out, is this the right decision, or if this is not the right decision and we need to not do this.
Excellent. So you actually answered the next question I was going to ask you. A bit of a mind reader there. So then, yeah. First, to Jason's point, one, it's important that we have this process in place in case we ever kind of have a presidential crisis where you have a president that is just overly abusive in their use of power, or maybe they try to stay in office after their term is up. Having some sort of formal system to remove a president in that kind of situation would be important. It's a protection against dictatorship. But then my follow-up question was going to be, why make it difficult to remove a president? Again, trying to get 2/3 of the Senate to agree to something, hard to do. And that really then ties into Jorgen's comment of, well, you don't want to make this too easy. Right. And to Jason's point as well, you don't want it to just be a situation where if the president is of one party and Congress is of the other party, they can just get rid of that president right away simply because they're of the opposite political party. You want to make sure that there's a serious and justifiable reason for removing a president from office. And so kind of setting that high bar of 2/3 of the Senate having to vote for removal. And so as a result, we've actually never removed a president from power through this process. 3 presidents have been impeached. One of them almost got voted to be removed. Andrew Johnson, the guy who took over after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. But the other 2 presidents that were impeached, Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, neither of them were really all that close to getting removed. Donald Trump a little close the second time he got impeached after the insurrection on January 6th. At that point, then all of the Democrats voted for his removal, as well as several Republican senators, which actually makes him the only president to have members of his own party vote for removal. In addition to that, then, the Senate also has the responsibility of ratifying treaties. So whenever some sort of new agreement is made with a foreign country, before that agreement actually takes effect, it goes to the Senate, and the Senate has to vote for approval. And then, as you might recall, the Senate also approves presidential appointments for a lot of positions. So presidents get to pick the members of their cabinet, the heads of the different departments of the executive branch. Presidents also get to pick ambassadors. They also get to nominate judges to the federal court, including the Supreme Court. But those are all positions that have to be voted on and approved by the Senate. And so that's one of the reasons why the Senate is kind of viewed as being the more powerful piece of Congress, because the Senate kind of has a lot of power over the presidency. A president may really want someone to be on the Supreme Court, but if the Senate's not a fan of that person's not making it onto the Supreme Court. To wrap up for today, then, also want to kind of look at the leadership positions in Congress, which is another difference between the House and the Senate. So in the House of Representatives, you have a position called the Speaker of the House. And the Speaker of the House is what's known as the presiding officer over the House of Representatives, meaning he or she really kind of gets to decide what laws is the House of Representatives going to vote on. And so the way that the Speaker of the House is decided is after every federal election, so after we get kind of a new House of Representatives every 2 years, one of the first things that new House of Representatives does is they vote on who they want the Speaker of the House to be, which the vote tends to be along party lines. So generally speaking, whichever political party has more seats in the House of Representatives, the House of Representatives or the Speaker of the House ends up being from that party. So for example, in the 2022 election, Republicans narrowly took control of the House of Representatives. There's just a few more Republicans than there are Democrats in the House of Representatives. And so as a result, Republicans voted for Kevin McCarthy to be the Speaker of the House because he was the Republican Party leader within the House of Representatives. Technically speaking, the Speaker of the House does not have to be a member of Congress, but tradition has been that the Speaker is a member of the House of Representatives. But in many ways, the Speaker of the House is one of the most powerful people in government, kind of just below the president in many ways. Because as Speaker of the House, he or she really does get to decide if Congress is even going to vote on a law, if the House is going to vote on a law. So if, for example, there's a law that maybe a lot of the American people want, if the Speaker of the House is not on board with it, he or she essentially can block it from even being voted on. And Jordan, great question. We're going to talk about that in more detail in a future lesson, but no. And we'll talk about why when we get to that point. So in many ways, the Speaker of the House is kind of the gatekeeper of the House of Representatives. He or she gets to decide what laws are even going to get voted on. Now, that position is unique to the House of Representatives. You don't have like a Speaker of the Senate. According to the Constitution, the Vice President is supposed to be the presiding officer of the Senate. But really, ever since the beginning, vice presidents have kind of blown that responsibility off. Generally speaking, vice presidents are only overseeing the running of the Senate if they need to be there as a tiebreaker vote, because that's one of the responsibilities of being vice president is if the Senate vote is a tie, the vice president gets to be the tiebreaker. So because vice presidents tended very early on to skip out on watching over the running of the Senate because it was a boring job that didn't give them any real power or responsibility, the Senate created the position known as the president pro tempore of the Senate. And the original idea was that this would kind of be the substitute vice president. When the vice president's not there to oversee the running of the Senate, the president pro tempore of the Senate would do it. Although the reality nowadays is whichever party controls the Senate, they kind of just rotate through the members of their party to be responsible for overseeing the running of the Senate. Oh, and I have a typo here. This needed to be corrected. The tradition is that whichever political party has the majority in the Senate, the member of their party who has been in the Senate the longest serves as the president pro tempore. And so that is currently Senator Patty Murray from Washington, if I remember correctly. I believe she got elected to the Senate in 92. So she's been in the Senate for 30 years at this point. So since the Democrats currently control the Senate, she is the president pro tempore. But if she retires, or if the Republicans take control of the Senate in the next election, that position would change. In addition to that, then, in both the House and the Senate, each political party has a party leader. The person who's kind of responsible for organizing the members of their party in either the House or the Senate, kind of coming up with a game plan of what they're hoping to do, what they want to accomplish, what are the things they want to vote on. Oftentimes kind of organizing as a group. Is our party going to vote for or against a law? And yeah, that's a fair point, Braden. And so because Republicans have the majority in the House, the Republican leader, Steve Scalise, is known as the majority leader. And because Democrats have less seats in the House of Representatives, the leader of the Democrats, Hakeem Jeffries, is known as the minority leader. Although technically speaking, Steve Scalise is kind of the number 2 Republican. Kevin McCarthy is number 1, but since he's now Speaker of the House, you kind of take the number 2 person in the party and name them majority leader, because the Speaker cannot also be the majority leader of their party. In the Senate, then, it's the reverse. Democrats currently control the Senate, so the leader of the Democrats, Chuck Schumer, is majority leader. And this is really the power position in the Senate. Whoever is the majority leader in the Senate, they really kind of get to decide what the Senate is going to focus on working on. And then, excellent question, Andy. Yes. The R's and D's represent if the person is a Republican or Democrat. So currently, Chuck Schumer really kind of gets to take the lead in deciding what the Senate is going to do, what things they're going to try to focus on voting on. In many ways, it's close to being like the Speaker of the House, but in the Senate. Finally, then, you also have what are known as the Congressional Party whips. And the job of the party whip is to go around and talk to the members of their party in Congress to make sure everyone's on the same page, that people are going to vote the same way. You can kind of think of the party whips as like being a sheepdog herding cattle. So the Democratic Party whip, for example, would go among the Democratic members of the House or the Senate and kind of check and say, hey, we're all planning to vote yes on this law. Are you going to vote yes? We want to kind of make sure we're united as a party. So that's kind of the responsibility of the party whips. Uh, because again, generally speaking, the parties like to be united in their vote. They all like to either vote yes or no on a law, depending on if they agree with it or not. So that's kind of the responsibility of the party whips, is trying to make sure everyone in their party is voting the same way. Ultimately, though, each member of Congress is free to vote however they want. So they might kind of have some peer pressure from their party to vote a certain way, but from time to time, members of Congress will kind of vote against their party if they personally disagree with it one way or another. There was actually just an example of that yesterday in the Senate for one of President Biden's nominations, I think to an environmental position. And um, all but one of the Republicans were against that nomination, but one Republican voted yes, and that provided just enough votes for that person to be approved for their position. So I see we're unfortunately out of time, so we will go ahead and end there. As always, if you have any questions, stick around, let me know. And yes, absolutely, I can go back a slide. And yeah, Braden, go ahead. And if you don't have any questions, you're of course good to go. You too, Noah. See ya. Yes. Okay. So to your question, Russia's currently led by Vladimir Putin, and Putin, came of age back when Russia was the Soviet Union, when it did have an empire and was viewed as being a very important and serious country. And so when the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia kind of lost all of its empire, Russia also lost a lot of its importance in the world. It was no longer viewed as being one of the most important countries. And so, in many ways, people interpret Putin's actions as kind of wanting to go back to the Russia that he grew up in, wanting to try to rebuild a Russia that is taken seriously and is viewed as a global power. And so, yes, his efforts to take land from neighboring countries, including Ukraine, most famously currently, in many ways is him trying to kind of rebuild the empire of the Soviet Union, trying to reestablish Russia as a world power. That, at least, the various things I've read, that's kind of the interpretation that a lot of people have of, like, okay, what is Putin trying to do here? What is he trying to accomplish? Um, he may in the short term. Obviously, the war in Ukraine is becoming a lot more difficult for him than he thought. Um, Ultimately, he may end up gaining some parts of Ukraine, but I think it's one of those things where it's ultimately hurting Russia more than it's growing Russia's strength. I think it's kind of proving to the rest of the world that Russia is not a country that you necessarily want to work with. And so in that regard, I think a lot of his actions will largely backfire. Yeah, you're welcome. Great question. See you. All right, and not seeing any other questions in the chat, I'm going to assume we are good to close up the room here.